Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The Revolutionary War, Part 1. There's a lot to America's Revolution, so we're going to talk about it a bit. We're going to talk about 5 or 6 terms that it's important for you to kind of key in on, right? So there's a lot to do with readings and primary documents and that kind of thing, so it can be complex. So let's dig into it. First off, political objective. All right, political objective. Wars, as Karl von Clausewitz tells us, are a continuation of politics by other means. And if that's the case, then if a country or a nation is engaging in a military conflict, then typically they are seeking to have a political objective met. They want something, right? So for America, during the Revolution, we need to understand, what is our political objective? What do we want out of this war? Do we want to go to England and take it over? Do we want to go up to Canada and take it and say, come on, guys, join in? What do we want? Now, the political objective for the Americans in the Revolution after 1776 is recognition as an independent, legitimate country, because we've declared ourselves to be that already. Prior to 1776, that's debatable, right? The question of what is it that folks are looking for in the midst of revolution. But after 1776, it becomes clearer that the Continental Congress, that the army, that the militias, that all of this process of revolution is in the service of the achievement of a political objective, which is recognition as an independent and legitimate country. All right. Number 2, Continental Army. Continental Army. We have, I would argue, over the last 20 years or so, come to think of those who fought in the American Revolution as largely guerrilla fighters or militia. And if you have had a teacher in K through 12 environment who just thinks that The Patriot, the movie, is the coolest thing ever, this is probably what you've been taught. The Second Continental Congress, right, the political arm of the Revolution, created and empowered the creation of a structured army, a professionalized military force in the service of the Revolution. They do this in 1775. George Washington is named as the commanding general. Militias will be a part of this process, but there is a structured military that Washington is trying to continue to build up. So it is important for us, I think, to recognize that when we're talking about battles and basic structures, when it comes to the revolution, much of this is being done by a professionalized, uniformed force that is in many ways guided by practices from Europe. All right. Number 3, Lord Dunmore. Lord Dunmore. We don't always recognize the role that race and gender play in the process of the achievement of independence, but they do have a very big role to play. Now, the British haven't gotten to be totally anti-slavery yet. This is going to take them some time. But in 1775, Lord Dunmore, the British official in charge in and around Virginia, he issues a decree where basically says, if you are an enslaved individual and you come with us to fight against the American revolutionaries, you'll be freedom. You'll be granted your freedom. Now, a number of hundreds of enslaved people will escape, will flee to the British lines, will either end up serving as camp workers for them, or will join the British Army to fight. Now, there's been a lot of scholarship done in the last few years that a number of those individuals would eventually, because of a smallpox pandemic that was traveling around the Americas at that time, many of them would eventually die, and the British also didn't treat them very well. But the idea from the British perspective was to kind of accomplish a few things here. And that actually leads Washington to support bringing in formerly enslaved individuals or free blacks into the Continental Army. He wasn't open to that, at least at the beginning. Again, he's a slave owner and stuff, and slavery's bad. All right. Number 4, remember the ladies. Remember the ladies. So this is a quote. This is a quote from a letter that Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John Adams. John Adams led the floor fight for independence in the Continental Congress and would eventually become the second president of the United States. She's well aware that states are creating new constitutions and that the Continental Congress has a great deal of power, and she's essentially lobbying her husband for gender equity here, some measure of gender parity here, which of course doesn't happen. What you'll eventually see out of this revolutionary era is a movement more towards companionate marriage, a bit different than what existed before, and the rise of a term for us to note called Republican motherhood. Right, this is another thing for us to note. Another term for us is Jane McCrae. Jane McCrae was a young woman in the colonies during the era of the Revolution who was brutally murdered by some indigenous people. Her assault was depicted in a painting, and it kind of depicts her fiance or husband kind of off in the distance running to get her, and these two men, wielding tomahawks, basically about to kill her. And the painting and her story, which her story is a tragedy, of course, but it kind of reflects how many white colonists thought about indigenous people and thought about Native Americans at the time. This sort of confirmation bias of savagery and brutality. All right, the last term for us is something called the Battle of Trenton. Now, this is where Washington will recross the Delaware River in December of 1776 and will engage Hessian troops there, taking hundreds of them prisoner and really kind of turning those first months of the war, which for the previous 6 months things had not gone well for the Continental Army. So the Battle of Trenton was a real success for the Americans and really kind of gives Washington a certain measure of support that the war could continue to go on for some time. Thank you.